There's a full court press on to create a one-world government right now. Where they once used climate change as justification, they are now using the excuse of the pandemic, suggesting that we cannot move forward without full vaccination of everyone in the world and without resetting the global economy to a green economy. President Trump stands in the way of this leftist agenda, which is why the Democrats support both Black Lives Matter and Antifa, and encourage the escalating violent race war, riots, and looting, hoping to pin it on Trump. But for some reason, the idea that the powerful of the world want to create a one-world government is seen as a conspiracy theory. It is anything but that. The idea for a one-world government goes back to Egyptian kings whose stated desire was to rule all that the sun encircles. Similar sentiments were expressed by Chinese and Japanese emperors, and this has been presented in various forms ever since. Writers, rulers, and philosophers from Dante, Kant, Lord Tennyson, Ulysses Grant, and more have also pined for a world under one government, arguing that there would be increased cooperation and no need for armies, and many of the institutions needed for global governments are already in place. The United Nations was founded in 1945, and almost immediately world figures like Einstein, Winston Churchill, and others argued that the UN's power was insufficient and that a federal world government was needed. Since then, the idea of a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly resurfaced from its original proposition in the 1920s by the now defunct League of Nations. On top of this, there is an International Criminal Court at The Hague in the Netherlands, a World Trade Organization, a World Bank, a World Police Force, Interpol, and more. The law of the sea was moved under the jurisdiction of the United Nations and is now known as the Convention on the High Seas. There's even a non-profit organization called the World Service Authority that provides a world passport on the strength of an article in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it is intermittently accepted by over 170 countries. A one-world government will form one day, and it will mark the beginning of a very long period of ever-increasing tyranny, if we are not prepared. That a one-world government will grow increasingly corrupt over time is guaranteed. All powerful organizations grow corrupt. Those with no opponents grow so faster and worse. The one thing that keeps wayward governments of the world somewhat in check today is international pressure through trade sanctions and the threat of war from the other nations of the world. There will be none of that under a one-world government, which will have control of the global military/police force and global economy through the monetary system. Today, political prisoners are held in Russia, China, North Korea, Cuba, and more, despite international scrutiny and pressure, which is why most nations of the world offer refugee programs. Under our present system, political dissidents whose lives are at risk for nothing more than their ideas can seek asylum in a friendly country, and approximately 40,000 people seek asylum in the U.S. alone each year. The acceptance rate runs from 40 to 55%. That's a lot of people deemed to be fleeing for their lives due to nothing more than their ideas. Where would they go under a one-world government? They will have nowhere to go. There will be no more political dissidents, not because the world is safe from corrupt governments, but because the entire world would be one enormous corrupt government with no place to escape to. We need to prepare for that now. As governments unite under one central power structure with global reach, so must men unite in order to have the strength to resist their urge to grab crushing levels of power. The human rights of men have been under attack globally for many decades. Under the guise of equality, feminists have been systematically dehumanizing white men, their original sworn enemy, since the formal launch of the feminist movement at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, and I suggest that you watch the video The Birth of Feminism for more details on this. Ideological feminists have since fully adopted Marxist theory almost in its entirety, starting in the late 1960s, as Aaron Pizzi frequently points out, replacing class with gender and capitalism with patriarchy. Black Lives Matter and Antifa have recently emerged as the militant wing of ideological feminism, while the Democratic Party has become its political muscle, and they are sowing hatred and violence for a reason. In this talk, I hope to show why feminism and its subsidiaries like BLM and Antifa are so powerful, and I hope to describe the role that feminism, which has taken control of the Democratic Party, plays in the long-running effort to forge a one-world government. That men dominated and oppressed women throughout history, as feminists claim, is an abject lie, and I have dealt with this in the video, The Birth of Feminism. What I'd like to highlight now is how men have been attacked and marginalized, not just in the public square with juvenile nonsense complaints like manspreading and mansplaining, but in law and public policy to such a degree that we must conclude that men's basic humanity has been deeply undermined. And this has been going on for a very long time, as evidenced by E. Belfort Bax in his book The Fraud of Feminism, written in 1913, and humorously illustrated by Esther Vilar in The Manipulated Man, first published in 1971. This is not by any means a comprehensive list, but a selection of the systematic disadvantages that men face all around the world. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read them out, but you can scan them here if you need to remind yourself of these injustices. Any one of these issues, and there are more, if affecting women, would spark a global movement and generate billions of dollars in support, but nothing at all is forthcoming for men. The dehumanization of males is accelerating as feminism spreads around the world, and it is facilitated by the widely accepted idea that men are disposable. Where does this idea come from? The idea that males are disposable is described in detail by Warren Farrell in his book The Myth of Male Power, and it is the subject and title of a book by Michael Gilbert, The Disposable Male. This attitude is revealed on a daily basis and in no uncertain terms by our responses to serious events like the Boko Haram incidents. Since their formation in 2002, Boko Haram has kidnapped young boys and forced them to become soldiers, and has slaughtered men and boys by the thousands, often burning them alive. And yet there was no broad public outcry until 276 girls were not burned alive, but merely kidnapped in 2014. Their kidnapping led almost immediately to a global campaign called Bring Back Our Girls, which attracted celebrities, business leaders, and national governments alike, including the White House. There is still no concern over the fate of boys and men at the hands of Boko Haram, and there likely never will be unless men organize globally. Governments have proven that they will not take action. But why is this happening? It has to do with the moral basis for male disposability. Warren Farrell and others argue that in every culture throughout history, what is moral is behavior that is thought to promote the survival of the group, and what is immoral is behavior that could threaten the survival of the group. This is the basis for every moral code in every culture throughout history, and it is consistent with the idea of survival of the fittest in the theory of evolution. Groups that survive enforce behaviors that benefit the group and prohibit behaviors that place the group at risk. In early history, the survival of humanity depended upon males being put in harm's way for the sake of the group. Males in all cultures were taught or forced to do this, and they still do. If there was an early civilization that didn't, well, it's not here for that very reason. The males could not or would not defend it. This naturally led to the realization, coded in almost every culture, that for the sake of survival of the group, the males must be disposable. Control of a territory, and therefore its resources, is also a necessity for survival for all living things. It is not optional. Wolves do it, monkeys do it, and as Jordan Peterson points out, even lobsters do it. It has been the reason for countless wars and rivers of blood, because death awaits those who lack resources. The history of humanity is a story of men forced into competing for territory and resources, and building and protecting the societies that they created. This necessity compelled men to build this world almost entirely unassisted by women, whose main responsibilities necessarily lay in the domestic sphere throughout most of human history. Even today, it is men who invent, build, protect, and maintain virtually everything, despite the near infinite and aggressive attempts to encourage and support those women who do want to contribute. To females, the human male is the resource. They compete for men in the way that men compete for resources. This is why women were not as loyal to their country and land as are men. First of all, women did not risk their lives acquiring, building, and protecting the country that provided them with absolutely everything they needed, so they were not as psychologically invested in it. But more importantly, they knew that if the men of their tribe lost to the men of another tribe, they would not only be spared, but would be able to mate with them, and would be protected by even stronger men. They would still have children, and their lives may even improve after their original providers were slaughtered. Most of this is subconscious, but history bears this out in the Viking slaughter of early Britain, as Warren Farrell points out, where women fell in love and married the conquerors who slaughtered their husbands. And the truth of this is seen in the way that women compulsively present themselves to sports heroes, political leaders, and wealthy businessmen, and in the way that women trade up in partnerships to more powerful men, and almost force themselves upon the ultra-powerful. Power-obsessed megalomaniacs have always been a part of humanity, and they always will be. From Genghis Khan to Alexander the Great, the pharaohs of Egypt and the emperors of Rome, each of the top rulers saw themselves not just as powerful men in their communities, but as the rightful emperor of the entire known world. They were not driven merely by the accumulation of wealth and luxury. They were driven by something much deeper in the human psyche, the lust to be the one top dog, king and emperor of all, a godlike ruler of the universe against whom no man may stand. It is the same psychic force that drives a prize fighter to reach for world champion status, but on a much larger scale. The super wealthy are compelled to battle for domination of the world as certainly as a lobster is compelled to battle to expand and dominate its territory, which is its world. Success in a competition triggers a positive feedback response in the individual that encourages not just satisfaction and a sense of accomplishment, but an increased drive to even greater competitiveness and aggression. The drive to compete is such a powerful obsession that it expresses itself in almost every social activity, even in casual conversations. And to these top human males, the entire globe is the territory under dispute. The earth itself and everything in it and on it, including us, are the disputed resources. Humanity has not changed since the ancient days of emperors and pharaohs, and each of the ultra-powerful in the world today sees himself as the first emperor of Earth. But you cannot be an emperor unless the world is unified under one governing body, a one-world government in the New World Order. To bring about a one-world government, you first need to convince people that it is necessary. Lo and behold, we have been told that there are multiple crises crises facing all of humanity that can only be addressed by an organization with global reach. First climate change and now the pandemic. I don't believe that the coronavirus was deliberately created and released. There is no need to create a crisis because there's always a crisis at hand that can be used as an excuse or a weapon to whip up fear and to justify the sort of lockdowns and loss of freedom that we are now seeing. Like monkeys in the jungle, the ultra-powerful just pick up a nearby rock or stick from the ground to use as a weapon because they are everywhere. The left has been trying to usher in their new green global utopia for decades, but the public has been lukewarm to their fear-mongering. The fear of climate change has not been enough to motivate the public to accept the totalitarian vision of the globalists. They needed something bigger, and the coronavirus presented them with an opportunity to bring the hammer down and force their agenda upon the entire world. Jordan Peterson said that, quote, "If you can't understand why someone is doing something, look at the consequences of their actions, whatever they may be, and then infer the motivations from their consequences." Unquote. And I'd like you to keep this in mind as I continue on. The coronavirus lockdown has shut down air travel for the masses. It has greatly reduced car traffic and oil consumption is way down. It has given the masses a taste of universal basic income, destroyed small businesses, making workers beholden to large corporations. It has radically boosted the profits of the large corporations, radically increased the power of the super wealthy, and it is being used to rationalize green agendas and to make people accept that this is the new normal. The ultra-powerful are pushing for health passports to be used even for entry into supermarkets and public buildings. People are being arrested for not wearing a mask. Many jurisdictions are under quarantine, with people only allowed out of their homes in order to go to work or buy supplies. And it has caused people to start policing their own neighbors, just like in previous murderous regimes. They have made people too frightened of each other even to gather, much less resist this massive takeover. In short, the consequence of the response to the scamdemic has been the realization of the very goals that the radical left have unsuccessfully pursued for decades to a T. A radical socialist world controlled almost entirely by a small group of extraordinarily wealthy and powerful people. It is globalism. Is it a mere coincidence? Are we all suddenly blind? And furthermore, major global players like George Soros, Bill Gates, Henry Kissinger, Prince Charles, and many others started insisting that the global economy be reset in accordance with, you guessed it, the exact globalist goals that they failed to implement through negotiation, almost as soon as the quarantines over the scamdemic began. It's almost as if they had their arguments prepared in advance. Article after article in the mainstream media is pushing for this. As if on cue, global leaders like former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown and Henry Kissinger and many other world leaders began to insist that we need a global government in order to combat the coronavirus within weeks of the start of the quarantines. And at this year's World Government Summit, As Salam Alaikum insists, quote, "A whole of government and whole of society approach is essential, not only for defeating the pandemic, but for the recovery." Resetting the global economy under a one-world government has always been the goal of climate change activists, and the scamdemic is being used to scare the world into compliance. But these leftist goals cannot be advanced without the cooperation of the United States. In other words, Trump is just about the only thing that stands in the way of a one-world government. The Democratic Party is the party of the leftists, the feminists, Black Lives Matter, Antifa, and the globalists. And they are encouraging and promoting the riots, violence, looting, and the race war, and trying to blame it on Trump in order to win the November election. With Trump out of the way, there is virtually no major public voice in the world that stands in the way of the one world government and New World Order. The fall of the U.S. to the globalists will be the fall of humanity into tyranny. But what role does feminism play in all of this? This is an important question. Throughout history, the very powerful rulers of the world, without exception, needed and sought a secure, cheap, and reliable workforce. Slavery was a common way to achieve this, but other mechanisms were also employed, like indentured servitude, the creation of caste systems, and the exploitation of workers who had no other options but to starve and let their families die. The only alternative to a system of compelled labor is for all citizens to have the right and responsibility to take control of their own futures, with the incentive that their right to enjoy the fruits of their own labor be protected by law as citizens with individual rights, the very thing that leftists are attacking today. Using the coronavirus as an excuse, thousands of small businesses have been forced to shut down, and a great many will never reopen, while the mega corporations owned by the ultra-wealthy were allowed to continue to operate. The profits of Amazon, Google, Walmart, Costco, and the other tech monopolies like Facebook, Twitter, and Zoom, and many others have gone through the roof, while regular middle-class business owners have been driven into bankruptcy. And this was predicted in advance. The low-cost workforce now swells with the ranks of those whose businesses have been destroyed and whose jobs at smaller competitor companies have been eliminated. The coalition of the super-wealthy knows that they need to cooperate with one another at this stage in order to crush those who oppose a one-world government, like Trump. And they all know that each of them sees himself as the first emperor of Earth. They know that there will eventually be a battle for power at the top after the world is brought to heel, but the coalition is a necessary stepping stone in the quest for ever more power. They have self-selected for this battle. Non-megalomaniacs have dropped out of this race long ago, and what remains are the truly deeply lustful power-mongers who feel so close to success that they can taste it. They are reaching for the highest level of power and status ever available in human history, and they are fighting for a legacy for themselves and their descendants to be recognized as the first dynasties and the first true emperors of the entire planet Earth. They also know that control of the world will be divided up among them, even if they do not become the first emperor themselves. Just like the mafia divides up its territories among the top bosses after the bloodshed in the battle for leadership is over. And these megalomaniacs see all other men at best as work slaves, peasants, and pawns, or perhaps even more accurately, as a farmer sees his livestock. They nurture those that serve their purpose, often with a convincing display of false respect, and slaughter them without a second thought when it is profitable to do so, or when they become a burden. They see you as they see their other assets, forest resources, oil resources, and mineral resources. To them, you are merely human resources to be used. They view all other women as potential harem members and playthings, but more importantly, they understand the power of using women to control the male work-slave population. That's the main reason that the ultra-wealthy support feminism so strongly. That is why feminism is their queen, the most powerful piece on the chessboard. Feminism has been eroding the status of men for many generations, a trick that wealthy, powerful men could never have pulled off on their own. But how does this work? Largely due to lobbying by feminist organizations, a woman today has the power to destroy a man's life upon her word. In many jurisdictions, a single accusation of domestic violence or sexual assault, even without evidence, kicks an entire team of professionals into action, the net result of which is that the man loses his children, his home, much of his income, his reputation, and most of his friends. Think about the case of Johnny Depp, whom we only know about because of his celebrity status. Many men never recover from this, and those that do are so focused upon protecting what they have managed to rebuild that they will not even speak about the abuse done to them for fear of being targeted a second time. No man is safe from the power of the false accusation, as Strauss-Kahn, former president of the International Monetary Fund, found out in 2011. Christine Lagarde was installed as his replacement. And women enjoy this power over their husbands and partners even without divorcing. The mere hint that she is upset and might consider divorce is enough to make a great many men recoil in horror and give his wife literally anything she asks, no matter the personal or family sacrifice required, because every man knows about the horror of divorce court, and each time the husband caves in, he loses a little more of his will to resist. By her often ridiculous demands like remodeling the kitchen a third time or going on an overpriced luxury vacation, she is pushing her husband's retirement further into the future and sentencing him to a life in which he will never escape his economic slavery to enjoy a smidgen of retirement, a benefit that she may have enjoyed her entire life at his expense. And feminism is largely responsible for the greatly reduced human rights of men. But why do wealthy, powerful men donate such an enormous amount of money to feminist organizations that openly hate men? Remember that Jordan Peterson said that if you can't understand why someone is doing something, look at the consequences of their actions, whatever they may be, and then infer the motivations from their consequences. The consequence of dehumanization of men is a submissive, secure, entrapped, and reliable workforce. But there's more. A man with wealth and therefore independence is a potential competitor. Men, by and large, try to build their own wealth, often with the goal of making themselves independent of the workforce and leaving a legacy for their children. This wealth no longer circulates in the economy, but represents a man's part ownership of the means of production through his investments. And through inheritance, it can provide economic independence to future men who would otherwise be bound to submit themselves to the general pool of working man-slaves. Economically free men are not only potential competitors, but their absence from the slave pool pushes the cost of labor up. Women, on the other hand, are net consumers. They are more likely to buy the latest glitzy bauble, and since their wealth is usually not earned but granted to them through divorce or inheritance, the labor of men in other words, they often do not have the same sense of prudence about finances as men who have had to earn every dollar. So prices can be grossly inflated, as we see with the majority of products targeted at women. It is for this reason that women are so strongly targeted in advertising. They control the majority of discretionary spending. The super wealthy know this, and so it is very important to them to encourage a sense of dissatisfaction with life in women. A dissatisfaction which can be remedied by purchasing new stuff. And if that's not enough, then divorce ensures the transfer of wealth from men to spendthrift women, often even to the point of utterly destroying the man. Furthermore, even though men pay the majority of the taxes collected by governments, this money is overwhelmingly spent on women. Imagine how much worse that would be under a one-world government, which will almost certainly be controlled by feminists, just as the United Nations is a fully committed radical feminist organization. So will a one-world government be, but much worse. Impoverishing the men who might otherwise climb to economic independence has other easily recognizable benefits for those at the very top. An impoverished man is no threat as a competitor. An impoverished man needs his job, often right up to the end of his life. He cannot afford to complain or make waves. He cannot afford to upset his boss. He is now a compliant work slave for life, and I have witnessed this exact change in newly divorced men that I have worked with. A man who is forced to work to the end of his days is more likely to die soon after retirement, thereby reducing the cost of pensions paid out. A man is often well past his prime when everything he has sacrificed for is torn from him. He is more costly to the business and may not be as productive as a younger man. If he falls into depression and commits suicide, the business may not have to pay any pension at all, and they will replace him with a younger, cheaper worker. Remember, if you can't understand why someone is doing something, look at the consequences of their actions, whatever they may be, and then infer the motivations from their consequences. Destroying men who have mostly served their purpose has no downside for the ultra-powerful. The destroyed man's resources are recirculated into the economy as he sells his investments in order to survive, and so his part ownership in the means of production returns into the hands of the ultra-powerful. The number of potential competitors is reduced, and another female is released into the harem pool with her ex-husband's money to spend. Feminism has also successfully lobbied to lower the job entry and promotional requirements for females while maintaining higher standards for men, or even barring men from consideration in many cases. This is part of an effort to place as many women as possible in charge of as much of society as possible and as quickly as possible, often favoring comically incompetent women over extraordinarily qualified men. In other words, feminism has resulted in women being given near absolute power over men in private and public life and in the workplace, and this effort is accelerating. Why? The super wealthy are super wealthy only because they have an incredibly sharp and well-tuned sense of where the levers of power truly lie. They are not fooled by flashy cars, wild claims, big muscles, or ego trips. The ultra-wealthy never foolishly waste their money, and they are spending uncountable billions, if not trillions of dollars in promoting feminism everywhere in the world. They have a nose for power, and there is not a single chance in an infinite universe that the wealthy and powerful are unaware of the power and control available by elevating women over men through feminism. There is not one sliver of humanitarianism, goodwill, or altruism involved. And even though our culture is deeply gynocentric, they are not even motivated by gynocentrism. It is but a circumstance that they take advantage of. Everyday people are gynocentric, but the ultra-powerful are strategic, and they are fully focused on the levers of power, one of which is feminism's incredible ability to subdue and subjugate men, the workhorses of civilization. Let me ask you this. How do the most notorious organized criminals in the world control the men in their circle? They threaten their families, and the men fall completely in line. The wealthy fund feminism, and feminism threatens a man's connection with his family, the deepest and most powerful connection a man will ever feel in his life, and the men fall in line. The super wealthy fund feminism because it is one of the best tools to control men and keep them trapped to the workforce through economic slavery. Demanding women with the power to destroy the men in their lives will keep those men under control far better than an army of brutal overseers ever could. The brilliance of feminism is that it turns every woman into an unpaid overseer of the men in her life. Constantly told that she is oppressed on all sides, she is ever vigilant, ever watchful, quick to complain, quick to make demands, quick to punish, and quicker to destroy. Every man is now scrutinized and controlled in the workplace, in public, and in his own home. Not only are these overseers unpaid, but they extort men's money through the threat of divorce or false accusations, and put it back into the hands of the super wealthy by buying mountains of worthless, glitzy baubles. Every dollar spent supporting feminism likely returns $10 through women's obsession with buying new shiny objects and remodeling the home, by going on overpriced vacations, with her use of the divorce industry, which chains impoverished men to a workforce from which death is their only escape. By amping up women's desire to acquire using men's money, they ensure that very few men ever escape economic slavery, much less become a threatening competitor. If feminists secretly understand any of this, then it is to their delight, because they are consumed with the hatred of men. Their sense of inferiority, their anger, and lust for power even blinds them to the ultimate fate of women in the future one-world government that they are helping to create, which is sex slave. Once they have served their purpose helping to usher in a one-world government, these powerful men will see women in the same way that all powerful men in history have viewed peasant women, as harem members for the most beautiful and domestic servants for the plain. Even the most beautiful women will be sent back to endure the mercies of their families once their beauty fades, exactly as it has happened in the past. And women will compete for a spot in a wealthy man's harem in droves. Women throughout history have gone for the most powerful man they can get, and that means upwards in social status. A woman sees a powerful man as being at her back, extending his power and status onto herself, which, by the way, is how Kamala Harris achieved her success. The overwhelming majority of women will happily share a bed in the home of a super wealthy, powerful man with 1,000 other women rather than stoop to commit herself to a man below her status level. And all men will have been forced below her status level in a one-world government. Once in place, this will last 1,000 years or more. Let's talk about the upcoming election. For decades, the Democrats have portrayed the Republicans as the party of white people. But how did Democrats sell racism against white people as virtue, and why? First of all, we need to recognize that the Democratic Party might as well be called the Feminist Party of the United States, because it is the party of radical feminism, much like the United Nations. And the feminist dehumanization of men began a transformation decades ago when they tried to explain that it was privilege that gave men power. The wealthy women who dominated the feminist movement decades ago could not deny that they too held privilege. And this started a procession of enemy labels, a practice, by the way, that feminists themselves hypocritically deride as, quote, othering. The sin of privilege evolved from male privilege to white guilt, to white fragility, and most recently to just plain whiteness. And this last step was their most powerful invention for stirring up hatred, racism, and violence to date. And feminists go to great lengths to disguise this racist invention by claiming that whiteness doesn't refer to the color of your skin, but to, quote, white culture, by which they then claim means Western culture. And they further clarify this to mean their arch-enemies, patriarchy, capitalism, and democracy. The problem with Western culture is that it does not have a face, and it is very hard to get angry, hysterical, and murderously violent over a complex, all-encompassing, and abstract concept like culture. When you hear the term culture, you quite rightly think of Western music from jazz, classical, rock, and blues to hip-hop and rap. You think of sport like basketball, football, hockey, soccer, swimming, cycling. You think of science, film and theater, industry, language and literature, politics and law, etc., etc. In other words, you think of all the things that make up a culture, which includes all of the races of people, both male and female, straight and gay, who live and thrive within that culture. Western culture includes everything and everyone that lives and thrives within Western society. Western culture does not have an identifiable face on the street. But whiteness does have a face. Whiteness is clearly identifiable on the street, on television, in the workplace, and in political office. Whiteness is an identifiable cohort of people. The very fact that feminists had to go to great lengths to justify their use of the term whiteness instead of Western culture reveals that they know that they are deliberately targeting white people to inflame a violent, racist uprising in the streets. These feminists call themselves scholars, and they know that a scholar's primary concern and duty is specificity in the use of words. They did not embrace the term whiteness because it was the only or even the best term to describe the issues that they critique. They embrace the term whiteness because they know that it will inflame a race war. And it is no accident that the term whiteness miraculously appeared in feminist discourse only after Black Lives Matter emerged to claim that the U.S. is saturated in anti-black racism. BLM, which is a feminist movement, not a black movement, as their website made clear until they just recently scrubbed that content, also went to great lengths to create a victim story. And even though their victims are almost without exception violent criminals, the narrative stuck because the liberal-controlled MSM mainstream media heavily promotes it and the Democrat Party embraces it. Once they had created a victim narrative centered around blackness, they needed a villain narrative centered around whiteness, and it was duly created. The term whiteness was deliberately chosen knowing that it would be understood by the already violent and angry segment of our culture as justification and permission to eliminate the newly identified problem, eliminate whiteness, eliminate white people, and thus start a race war. Smash the patriarchy has become smash whiteness. The authors and preachers of whiteness is the problem are very smart and powerfully supported. They are smart enough and well-funded enough to successfully turn male privilege, white guilt, white fragility, and now just plain whiteness into household terms heard and understood throughout the Western world. They have been perfecting this game for many decades. Pause for a moment and reflect on this claim. Whiteness is the problem. Whiteness is the problem. Where have we heard similar sentiments before? And wasn't that regime intent on global domination? The goal of the left is to destroy Western culture so that they can usher in their utopian New World Order. Provoking a race war goes a long way towards smashing the patriarchy, which now means smashing whiteness. So to answer the question, how did feminists/Democrats start a race war? First, they sold the public the idea that Western culture, meaning patriarchy, capitalism, and democracy, were responsible for all of the problems of the world. Then they replaced Western culture with whiteness, which is an easily identifiable face on the street. Then the idea that whiteness is the problem naturally became the rallying cry for all of their duped supporters. The Democrats now sit back and watch the violence and destruction with glee, pretending to be innocent. And why? Well, in order to provoke a race war and spin the Republican Party as the party of whiteness, the party of racism, and therefore the party that represents all of the problems of the world. The ultimate goal is to replace Trump with an easily controlled puppet, thus removing all resistance to the formation of a one-world government. They will have that puppet in Kamala Harris, who has a long history of corruption in the pursuit of personal power and was handpicked to be president. It's clear that Biden will not serve a full term if elected. So Harris is the globalist candidate, itself a decidedly tricky, anti-democratic move. Kamala Harris, like Christine Lagarde of the IMF before her, becomes the next in a long line of women handpicked and placed in prominent positions of power by the ultra-wealthy who support feminism globally. Feminism is their queen with the power to subjugate men. All of humanity will suffer under a one-world government, but none more so than men. Men are seen as a giant pool of work slaves who must be prevented from becoming competitors and thus a risk to the ultra-powerful. But that is also our strength, because this world cannot run without men's labor. In fact, if even half of the working men of the world walked off the job at 10 a.m., the world would grind to a halt before lunch. But we must be organized. Human rights, especially for men, were never granted willingly, but were fought for at the cost of millions of lives and rivers of blood over thousands of years. These rights are under attack, and in a one-world government there will be no international community to object and no safe havens to run towards. For a taste of what a one-world government without a global union of men would look like, consider how the companies now owned by these globalists treat their employees in third-world countries. The idea that corporations like Nike and tech companies that run out of India, for example, would voluntarily share any of their profits with their workers is laughable. Even when faced with international pressure today, these companies continue to use slave-like labor and ignore the legitimate needs of their workers. And it will be much worse under a one-world government. A one-world government would have no opposing countries that could sanction them for human rights abuses, and political dissidents would have no sanctuary countries to run to as refugees. We are looking at the worst possible nightmare, and it will come to pass if we remain complacent. Our mission today is to form a global union of men, complete with dues, global and local organization, benefits for members, funds available to defend members, and legal attack teams to take on spearhead issues like the strategy modeled by the National Coalition for Men. That the ultra-wealthy will succeed in the end, I think, is inevitable, and I hope to convince you that we need to stand up for our human rights or they will disappear. Our quality of life will dramatically decline, and this brief post-World War II period will fade into the history books as an aberration, as the only period in human history in which significant numbers of people enjoyed a modicum of prosperity and freedom. This is not about one industry or one country. The very humanity of men is under attack globally. All men of all races globally. We are being dehumanized and acclimated to that dehumanization. Feminism's role in the New World Order is to turn all women into an army that will control the male work slaves of the world. Women become a shield, protecting the ultra-powerful from men who might otherwise rise up as competitors, and they become an army of unpaid overseers who scrutinize men in every sphere of their lives, even in their own homes. This is a hard pill to swallow for some men, because we often think of ourselves as rugged individualists. But it is the height of naivety to believe that an all-powerful elite will voluntarily restrain themselves from rebuilding a system of slavery. They must be restrained by force, and that force is you and me, the men who invent, design, build, and maintain everything.